So I guess we'll get started then. It's nice to see my friend Larry from the city. He was a math teacher here after he came from South Africa, and it's good to see some people from Camrose here and some biology profs. Anyway, it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Chavik from University of Calgary. He has well over 100 publications in the area of computer models of plant growth. So I'm expecting, there'll be some fractals and things like that if you know about them. And this is, I think, a perfect topic for a public lecture because it'll be very visual and the symbolism that often accompanies math won't be heavily present, I'm guessing. So anyway, Dr. Chavik.
Good evening, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for the introduction and for having me here. Can you hear me well? Mic here? Sorry? Okay, is it better? Okay, thank you. So the question which I would like to address is, as a matter of fact, the fundamental question of developmental biology of plants, and it is, how do plants acquire their form? And well, my interest in this personally comes on one hand from biology, but on the other hand, that's because of the visual beauty of plants. I would like to convey some of this as well. So how come that a computer scientist is studying the development of plants? Well, there are several good reasons for using modeling and mathematical models in general. First, form is something which is studied by geometry, and the fact that plant form is much more complex than circles, triangles, and so on is no excuse to not use proper geometric methods. As a matter of fact, it is an indication that this kind of methods are really necessary if you want to truly understand the form. Second, I would like to quote Richard Feynman, who said that we understand if we can reconstruct. And this is particularly important when you try to create a mechanistic understanding of development, because mechanistic understanding means that you want to understand things in terms of cause and effect. And causal relations are very difficult to observe, if at all possible, experimentally. In contrast, when you create models, then we know precisely what are the causal relations there, because this is what we put there explicitly ourselves. Then you can study what are the consequences of different postulated mechanisms. And then, as you are going to see, there are lots of self-organizing processes in the development of plants where actually different parts interact, and through this interaction, form occurs, and self-organizing processes are notoriously difficult to comprehend without use of models, so this is one more reason for using them. Okay, so we know that we need models, and now the question is why? And this simulation of development of ball mustard is illustrating why we need models. You have seen that what is difficulty from a mathematical point of view. The point is that we start with a seedling, which has just two leaves, cotyledons, and then things are growing farther and farther, the number of organs increases, and we are getting quite a complex form of the final plant. So this creates difficulty, because if you look into the number of variables which are needed to describe the system, this number of variables increases over time. This is different of traditional understanding of dynamical systems, in which we specify in advance the space of states, which is characterized by some fixed number of variables, and then studying how these variables change values over time. In here, the space of variables is a state space, is not fixed but grows as well. And this creates a problem which was defined by, or named by two French researchers, Javito and Michel, as, well, dynamical system with a dynamic structure. So, in the case of development, we inherently deal with dynamical systems with dynamic structure, and the question is what mathematical tools you can use to describe them. And actually, this problem has been addressed, although not in these terms, as early in 1968 by the mathematical biologist Aristide Lindenmayer in a very seminal paper, Mathematical Models of Cellular Interaction in Development. And over there, he introduced a formalism which a few years later was termed after him, L system, after Lindenmayer, which provides a mathematical framework for dealing with dynamical systems, dynamic structure, which are spatially connected, elements of the systems. And it also provides a good mathematical basis for creating modeling languages and creating simulation software, which in a sense is general purpose, so that if you create different models, you don't have to create them from scratch in some general purpose language. You can create software which handles lots of different situations, and in this L system-based language, you describe specifics of the given model. So this very much facilitates experimentation with models. So, systems have been very much studied from the formal perspective because of the relation to the theory of formal languages, but I will introduce them not so formally, using the development of multicellular bacterium Anabena as a running example. So Anabena is a very old organism which actually is responsible for the introduction of oxygen to atmosphere. So it is something like 3.5 billion old, that's very much still around. And as you can see here in this microscopic image, cells of Anabena create filaments which can comprehend several types of cells, and the most important are heterocysts and vegetative cells. It is a very interesting question how the differentiation of heterocysts occurs, but I am going to focus on this segment between heterocysts, vegetative segments, in which cells divide, in which we can see some longer cells and some shorter cells. And for quite a long time, the question was whether this pattern of long and short cells actually is totally random, or whether there is some principle in it. And in 1972, Mitchell and Wilcox had a paper in Nature in which actually they described the rules for the development of this filament. And basically, they observed the following, that if we associate with cells a feature, which they call polarity, then we can have the following rules. Short cells just become longer. A longer cell will divide into longer and shorter cell, but on which side there is going to be the shorter cell depends on the polarity. The shorter cell is always in the same direction as the original polarity, and long has opposite one. So it turned out that actually this is sort of like poster child examples for systems. So the set of different states of cells, short, long, and with associated polarities, is called the alphabet of the L system. So it is the set of types of cells which we have. And then these rules which Mitchell and Wilcox described describe actually are seen as productions in a grammar or rewriting rules in a rewriting system. And this is not unlike, let's say, better known Chomsky grammars, which also have productions which operate on letters and produce strings of letters, except that in the case of L systems, productions are applied in parallel. And this parallelism is justified by the fact that time goes everywhere. So consequently, well, we have to progress with productions everywhere. And application of production represents progress of time by some fixed interval. So symbolically, we can write, we can describe this situation identified by Mishton and Wilcox as 4 productions shown on the left. And in order to complement the definition of a system, we have to specify what is the initial cell or initial state. And this is called axiom. So then we can see how we can use this formalism to simulate development. So in this case, starting from the long cell, according to the rule which applies for long cells polarity to the right, this rule, well, we are going to have long and short, and then we apply 2 productions simultaneously. We have this state, and this state, and this state, and this actually corresponds to the actual progression of sequences of short and long cells and filaments, and this turned out to be actually quite deterministic description of what can be seen in nature and what originally, before this pattern was discovered, was considered just random. So, using a simulator, using a simulator, we can, well, a little bit extend this system so that we can use very small time increment, and then we can have simulation that, as you can see here, so the cells grow and divide, and the pattern is formed. Okay. So, up to now, what we can express using a system is just sequences of things. It turns out that it is possible to extend the definition of or interpretation of the systems using the notion of turtle geometry, which was invented in the late 60s at MIT, basically to teach well, programming to children. And if the idea is that you have, so the idea which was implemented in programming language Logo was such that children can, well, write small programs in which they instruct a turtle to walk around and draw lines. So in particular, in response to a command F, the turtle moves forward. And in response to commands right or left, the turtle would turn. So now let's assume that if the turtle responds to the symbols of the alphabet, and in this case, which is the simplest one, we have 3 letters, F plus a minus. And consequently, if we have such a string of letters, and we assume that turns are by 90 degrees, and that the original orientation is upwards, then if this string will have the interpretation shown above. The first letter F means go up, then make a turn, then go to the right, plus the second F. The third design plus means to turn to the left, and we'll go up, 2 Fs, minus 2 Fs, minus F, minus F. Now we can marry these 2 ideas. The idea of generating strings of symbols using an L system, and the idea of interpreting them geometrically. And this turns out to be a very kind of fertile idea. First of all, it turns out that we can generate zillions of different fractals. So this is an example. We have an axiom minus F, well, representing the line which is horizontal, and a single non-identity production which replaces this single line by this kind of sequence. Actually, well, you can see here its interpretation. And now as we apply productions iteratively, then this, we are going to have replacement of individualized segments by this kind of polygons happening over and over again. So in this case, a system with certain interpretation encodes von Koch constructions of fractals, and you can have this type of fractals, like for example, and many others described by Mandelbrot in the fractal geometry of nature. Here are a few more examples which just illustrate how easily this kind of apparently complex curves can be specified using L systems. And we can further augment the set of objects which can be generated by introducing symbols which are used as symbols of alphabet of a system, but are not interpreted, so the therapist simply ignores them. And so, for example, on the left you can see the dragon curve, a very well-known fractal, and its very compact description. And on the right you can see the Sierpinski space-filling curve and its system description. So plans, however, are not two-dimensional, so we need to extend the geometric interpretation to 3 dimensions, and this can be done by introducing, 4 additional symbols, so that the tensor not only turns to the left and to the right, but also forward and backward and around its own axis. So, for example, this system is a little bit more complex, but actually it is describing quite a non-trivial object, a 3-dimensional piano curve. So it is a curve which fills a cube. Here it is how it looks after a single iteration. Okay. It has interesting properties that in each of the fundamental projections looks like 2-dimensional piano curve. And then we can perform another step. And we have, next iteration of the curve. And I'm not going to go further because then nothing can be seen. Because it's okay. So now these ideas apply quite directly to the description of plants. And the idea is that rather than having individual cells represented by system symbols, we are having entire modules such as buds, leaves, internodes as segments of stems between 2 branching points, and the apex, which is at the top of shoots, and it is the main engine of development. And it turns out that actually development of all higher plants, actually almost all plants, is very stereotypical, and it can be captured by the following rule. The apex produces apex and metamer. So basically it creates a metamer and reincarnates itself above, and the metamer is a structure which consists of an internode and a leaf, 1 or more, and buds, 1 or more, subtended by these leaves. So if we start with an initial structure, a single apex, which will be in a very little seedling already present, then by applying this rule once, we are getting this structure, and then applying the rule another time, we are getting this, and applying it another time, we are getting this situation. And we can capture this general principle of development using a L system rule, which is shown here. And the only novelty here is that we have square brackets to enclose branches. So if we have a situation where a structure is not just linear but with branches, we put branches in the brackets. So inflorescences or compound structures of flowers, such as shown here, are a perfect example of a system in action, a system of the type that I described in particular. And Here I have a simulation which shows how it goes. So we start from structure which is going to produce first some leaves, and then it produces flowers, and then flowers are undergoing their cycle of development from a bud, an open flower, to a fruit. And in such a way, we have captured this structure using basically a single rule with a few multipliers, so that flowers open and leaves look like leaves. As architecture is captured by this rule which I just showed. So the question is where diversity of inflorescences comes from. And it comes from the fact that if we go here, actually these buds are not physiologically different from the terminal bud. So they can also produce new axes. And well, one way of understanding the diversity of architectures of inflorescences is in terms of decisions which buds do what, which buds produce flowers, which ones nothing, and which ones are creating new axes of development. So in the case of racemes, or monopodial structures which I discussed, the main apex is vegetative, keeps producing new metamers, and laterals are producing flowers. But you can have different situations in which main apex is producing a flower, and lateral buds are creating new axes, at least for a short time, because then they produce flowers, but before this happens, they create lateral buds, which create next order axis, and this process is iterative. And this leads to the type of inflorescences which are called cymes. So this is a model of a plant which I don't think it grows in the prairies, definitely doesn't grow in Calgary, but it is very common on the west coast, Lichnis coronaria. Okay? So it looks very different from these racemes which we have seen first, but the difference is basically in the fate of buds. In this case, main buds are producing flowers, lateral are vegetative. The third possibility which is often found is shown in here. It is a situation in which all buds for a while create new branches, and then at some moment undergo a developmental switch, which can be triggered, for example, by days being very long or days being short, depending on what kind of plant it is. And then in response of some signal, they change their fate, and then they produce flowers. So a good example of this is, for example, is astilbe, shown here, also lilacs, a model of a lilac. So this is the sort of branching architecture in which you can see that branches are occurring of different orders, the main axis, the lateral axis, and so on. And now we put petals on it. Well, it almost looks like lilac. I'm saying almost because a real lilac has normally these flowers in pairs, inflorescences in pairs, actually here. And this example also illustrates how easily we can explore the effect of different rates of growth and branching on this architecture. So in this case, there are functions of position along the main axis which determine what is the expanse of lateral branches. I'm decreasing it, okay? Increasing maybe a little bit top. And also density can be controlled, or distances between lateral branches, so now decreasing the distances, and this creates denser structure. This kind of changes, although they have geometric character here, are something which is quite easy for a plant to control via genetic mechanisms, and this may explain if, in particular, effects of breeding. In the case of lilacs, for example, because they have high ornamental value, there are many different varieties of lilacs which are quite different from each other, even though this is the same species. So for example, here is a variety called Congo, and here is a variety called Etna. So, as you can see, we can create, well, model systems, quite complex branching structures, and in the sense the systems will provide insights how the iteration of the same process can create diverse architecture seen in nature. There is, however, a fundamental problem which is illustrated in here. It was described from a biological perspective by Borchert and Slade in 1981, but actually it is a very fundamental geometric problem. And this is how these structures are embedded in the two-dimensional ambient space. So imagine the following situation, for simplicity, that we have, well, an apex which just produces two lateral branches. And this is the procedure which iterates. So we start from a single apex. After year one, we are going to have 2, then we are going to have 4, then we are going to have, in principle, 8, 16, and the number of branches and everything which they carry is going to grow exponentially with time. We assume that when branching occurs 1 per season. So this is the problem, because the volume which is supposed to encompass this all the structure is growing only with a third power of time. The radius grows linearly because each year we are adding new segments. So volume grows with third power of radius, and the question is, well, how this exponentially growing number of elements is supposed to fit in space which grows only as a third power of time. And this can be actually also illustrated by the simulation. So here we have the situation in which, well, the apex produces only flowers. So it's like in racines which we have seen before. Everything beautifully fits in space. Now let's suppose that the lateral branches, the lateral paths are also producing branches, but then they don't branch any further. Things still fit. But if we increase farther and farther the degree of branching, then we are getting something which looks at the picture as a mess. And it is just an illustration of the fact that things basically, well, in this kind of figure, because it is not a variable of space, things are just going through each other, and in reality, it means, well, we have too much for Euclidean space to hold. So what are the solutions to this problem? Well, we have seen one to control the fate of paths carefully. There's also another one, which is to produce smaller and smaller branches with the order. And then you can get this kind of structures. And then, well, if some kind of other geometric parameters are changed, then we can have a variety of different architectures. So this looks very fractal and actually very much like many leaves, in particular in ferns. But also can be seen in some inflorescences which have smaller and smaller organs as we go with time. And this is definitely also a viable strategy for, well, dealing with this embedding problem. So to recap, we just creating branching topologies is not enough, and just putting things in space without monitoring whether they fit is not enough to understand fully the structures, branching structures of plants. We have to address the question which plants have to address necessarily. Well, how these things fit in space, and you see that it can be happening by controlling the number of branches and organs, or by gradually reducing branch and organ size, and of course it can also happen by combination. So now I would like to change gears a little bit from herbaceous plants, which, well, I hope I convinced you that with relatively simple systems we can capture quite a variety of architectures, and address the question which is actually more difficult, because the forms which we are going to be dealing now are much more complex. To what category do botanical trees belong? I put botanical because, well, in computer science we have all these branching structures which are called trees. So I'm talking about botanical trees, not computer scientific. So the first idea was that actually in the case of so the first idea was that this fractal mechanism is what is observed. And this was implemented by a Japanese researcher, Hisao Honda, who in 1971 created the very first model of three-dimensional model of trees. And this picture is actually taken from his paper. In 1971, this looked perfectly, kind of like it was impressive. But if you look at this now, okay, yes. So, yes, so the question was, to what category botanical trees belong? Whether they manage to be embedded in space without overflowing, which is not possible, by reducing the size of their branches, or by controlling carefully which buds are going to produce new branches. The first idea by Hisao Honda was that the branches are, that trees are addressing the embedding problem by reducing the size of the branches. Honda created this model which is shown here. This looked great at the time, but if you look at this now, I would say that it looks more like inflorescence of a grass than a tree. So a little bit later, three biologists who wrote a very famous actual book, Tropical Trees and Forests, an Architectural Analysis, in which they proposed what is known as architectural models of trees. They proposed 23 such models, which could be sort of seen as counterpart of these systems which I gave for racemes, cymes, and panicles. Well, trees are more complex, so there were 23 variants. And the underlying idea was, is actually well represented by the quote which I put here. Organization of trees reflects the precisely controlled genetic program which determines their development. So their point of view was that different architectures of trees, for which they produced sort of iconic images which were very sort of convincing, I have shown here a few of them, that this kind of blueprints of development are coded genetically, and if plants were living in an ideal environment, then trees would be very much similar to each other if they belong to the same architectural model. The environment is sort of bad guy, which is disturbing this idea, Platonic idea of different architectural models, and that's why, let's say, one oak is different from a different oak. As you can see in these iconic representations, they are very regular. It is quite different from what we observe in temperate climate trees. And this kind of observation led two researchers from Israel, Sachs and Nowoplansky, to write a paper in 1995, Tree Forms, Architectural Models Do Not Suffice. in which they proposed a different point of view. The form of a tree is generated by self-organization in which alternative branches compete with one another. And actually they put further, make further the point that they compete without any predefined plan. So, from modeling perspective, this looked like a fresh idea, because trying to model plants according to trees, according to these models of Allais, Oldman, and Tomlinson, according to the architectural models, turns out to be very, very complex. Basically, it is very difficult to define which buds should produce new branches, which not, and one can, by trying to create this kind of models, one feels that something is missing. And so here, the opposite idea is, well, what is missing is the notion of space in which things compete. But if Sachs and Nowoplansky wrote basically a position paper, they presented their point of view, they didn't support any evidence beyond their own intuition. So with my students, we decided to check whether actually we can create models based on this idea of competition and what would happen then. So since competition is, well, first of all, a competition for space, the question is how to represent space. One possibility is to represent empty space as the absence of anything. So there's kind of this great space for things to penetrate. But actually, it turned out computationally that it is more convenient to represent space as a cloud of particles which we call markers of free space, or sometimes just attractors, although they have nothing to do with attractors in the sense of dynamic systems. They are just particles, things for which different buds can compete. So then, a development of a model could look like this. We call this algorithm space colonization, because we are interested in how a branching structure can penetrate space represented by these free particles. So we start with a set of particles shown in blue and, well, initial apex at the base. And then what is happening is that the tree grows toward these particles and, well, using an algorithm which I'm not going into details, branches if there are some particles to the left and some to the right as well. And then, in this process of growth, it consumes particles, which indicates to other branches the space is no longer available. So this growth, in this case, is happening entirely through the competition for space, and actually there is no other element in this model. It doesn't look too much like a tree, but actually here is our visual system which plays games with us, because in this case all branches have been drawn with the same width, and we are perceiving this as something being wrong if we change width of lines so that the trunk is wider and lateral branches are smaller, then we get something which starts looking quite like a tree. And then if we change parameters a little bit and run the algorithm a little bit longer, we are getting this kind of structure which happens to look actually quite a lot like a frangipani tree. Not frangipani, actually jacaranda. Okay? So again, not a tree from here, but quite widely known. And here is another example. So this was a clear indication to us that Sachs and Nowoplansky had a very good intuition. That because just by running algorithms without a tuning, we are getting architectures which look to our eye very plausible. So then we started trying to find out, can we capture diversity of trees, and also can we create these models a little bit more biologically sound, because, well, competition for this market of space is quite a highly level structure. So we created a model which is controlled by light. And if different models for propagation of light in canopy have been proposed and implemented over time, we want to have a model which is fast so that we can play with this algorithm quickly. And we created an algorithm which is called shadow propagation. The idea is that if we put some element in space, then it casts some pyramid of shadow underneath. So this is something which you could expect happens in an overcast day, where elements just underneath a given one are going to be shaded, but further down the shade is going to sort of dissipate. And it turned out that if we have algorithm which operates on the principle, if you are in the shade, don't grow, if you are in full light, grow, and in between will grow a little more slowly, we are getting this kind of, well, everything is nondescript, but very plausible bush. So the question is how we can get diversity of plants now, of trees. And to investigate this, we are using another point made by Satin Woplansky, that actually what matters is not only the local environment of a given bud, but competition with neighbors. A bud in medium light would grow quite nicely if all other buds around have much less light, but if other buds have more light, then this medium one is actually going to be overcompeted. So, in order to simulate this, we implemented an algorithm which was originally proposed by Bosch and Honda, and the idea of it is the following one. Information about amount of light gathered by the apices is propagated downwards from apices towards the base of the tree. This is shown as these orange arrows. And then there's another information which represents vigor of branches in the entire tree, and this information propagates outwards, and if this distribution is guided by this information about light. This mechanism makes it possible to bias choices in the following way. If vigor is associated, is allocated exactly proportionally to the amount of light received, then, well, it's kind of situation like if we didn't, all decisions are made purely locally. But we can play in such a way that, for example, main branches are getting more vigor compared to lateral or vice versa. And then we are going to have a bias towards main or lateral branches. More specifically, this happens as follows. So in this propagation of information step from the leaves towards the base, we are adding contributions of light from higher branches, and this information propagates lower. And then we have vigor, which propagates upwards, and the distribution of vigor is captured by these formulas. So this basically means that if lambda is equal 1/2, lateral and main branch are going to have amount of vigor proportional to the distribution of light. If lambda is greater than 1/2, that main axes are going to be privileged, and if lambda is less than 1/2, then lateral is not privileged. It turned out that just by introducing this parameter, you can capture diversity of tree forms along one kind of axis of description, which is well recognized by horticulturalists, and this is a distinction between excurrent forms and decurrent forms. Excurrent forms are these which have a well-delineated trunk, and decurrent are those which don't. Lilac would be an example of the decurrent form, and poplar of excurrent. So then the question is, okay, so we already have one important parameter of form. What are other important factors which affect form? And another important factor is branch orientation. So we could say that by default, a branch grows in the same direction in which it was already growing. But it is known that the direction is affected on one hand by gravity and another by light. And by gravity it can be affected in two ways. One is passive bending like in a willow. Simple branches are, terminal branches are so flexible that they hang. But there also can be active redirection, either downwards or most often upwards. So this results in an adjusted neural direction, and then from one ear to another we have this kind of adjustment, which, as it turns out, has a very big impact on form. So here you can see a couple of trees in which we have incorporated upward orthotropism, so this tendency to grow upwards. Here, in a very contrasted form, we see an example of plagiotropism, so this is the tendency of branches to grow horizontally. And here we have pendulous habit, like in a willow, well, and there are other examples of plants like this. So as a matter of fact, to explore this, and also for sort of artistic effects, we created an app, a tree sketch, and I would like to show you how easy it is to explore these kind of things, but unfortunately, I have to switch to a very scientific device, iPad mini, okay? So this is an app which was created by one of my students. It's called Tree Sketch, and well, you can download it from iTunes or from App Store for free. And basically, it shows how you can grow trees according to the algorithm which I just described. So here I have button grow, and well, here it goes. Okay, and this is a tree which grew as a result of the algorithm which I described. Now we can change parameters. In particular, so I'm going to new tree. We can change tropism from the downward tropism, which was present in the example just showed, to the upward tropism, and grow again. And you can see that we obtained, well, a very different effect. This still does not look like an excurrent tree, a tree with pronounced trunk, but you can go change parameters again, and now increase apical dominance. And well, then it grows quickly upwards. Okay, and you have this kind of form. So there's a number of parameters there, and it takes some time to play with it, so I don't want to spend too much time. But also, when designing this, we use this fact that actually space must be available, and availability of space is something which can be quite easily controlled interactively to transform this a little bit into a tool for artists. So I'm going to show you this artistic effect as well. So here we have different types of trees which have been defined before, and actually the parameters can be loaded. So I'm loading parameters for this tree. And now, this is in relation to this, magic wand and stardust. I am going to use my finger to create markers of space towards things can grow. Okay? And in this way, you can control development of trees quite easily. You can still use it to explore the architectural effect of different types of growth. So, if you create kind of upwards motion strokes, we are going to have more upward form. On the other hand, if you create lateral motions, it's going to be more plagiotropic form. You can rotate it and kind of cut branches in 3 dimensions. Okay. And then you can also create more downward motions to create a form of tree form, which has more pendulous kind of habit. Like some weeping willow or something. Okay? So this is quite addictive for a while. But as you can also see, this is quite easy to use, so I hope that some of you will find it fun. And actually, well, I know that I should not be saying this because it's bragging, but if you go to the first Hobbit movie, then much of vegetation there has been created using this algorithm. And my student went there to help them with the developing program for this. So this algorithm seems to be capturing the structure of trees quite well. I have a few more examples of diversity which can be obtained. I'm not sure how scientific this is, but here are more examples. Okay, you can zoom on branches. Here's another example. And then you can create scenes with this kind of trees. Okay. So it seems that actually, if Saxon-Lansky had a very good intuition, and through the modeling we are able to validate this intuition by showing that indeed, development of trees is very much governed by competition for space, and this competition decides which branches are going to grow and which ones will not. So consequently, just considering branching topology while abstracting from space is not good enough. There is also a bonus which is inspired by a surrealist painting by René Magritte, shown here, and he painted a few other things in this style. It is basically hard to tell whether it's supposed to be leaf standing upwards or a tree, and he was conveying this idea that trees and leaf vasculature are sort of looking alike. And indeed, if we use the same algorithm of colonization for space, but in a plane rather than 3D, we can capture vasculature of leaves. So here it is ginkgo, on the left it is a real leaf, on the right it is model. Alchemilla, so it is again on the left it is real, on the right it is model. Nanking cherry and poplar. When in the case of poplar, we have enhanced algorithm a little bit, so there are also loops created. So it seems that this idea of competition for space, finding out how close I am, measuring distances, is actually a very important element of the development of plants. Which leads us to the conclusions. So, first, modeling of plant development requires non-standard methods. And this non-standard is manifested, on one hand, in the fact that we are dealing with dynamic systems with dynamic structure, and on the other hand, that actually we have to really put space front and center of programs. This is different from much of computer graphics, which, and let's say from, well, let's put it this way, from much of computer graphics, where basically we are just plotting, in a sense, some plot of functions. But whether things intersect or not, well, it is not necessarily immediately visible. Of course, there are algorithms for handling intersections and for handling collisions, but in the case of plants, this how space is being, space plays a very fundamental role. Second thing is that plant form is to a large extent a result of self-organization. Diversity of plant forms is controlled by a small number of parameters, and this is important because it provides a link to genetics. We can understand how different mutants or different transgenic plants may acquire, or results of breeding, you can produce different forms because they don't have a very fundamental effect. They just change some parameters, and these parameters, through self-organization, create different forms. And maybe it is a little bit of a kind of leap compared to what I was presenting here, because I was not talking at all about genetics, but it seems that understanding of plant development and form from genes to microscopic forms is within reach. It doesn't mean that these models are going to be predictive in fine detail, but it is in principle felt that you can understand how different genetic mechanisms create a playground in which, through self-organization, forms emerge. And then I found these sentences from a book, popular book by Peter Stevens, Patterns in Nature, where he also very much emphasized the role of space. He wrote, empty space is an architecture that makes real demands on things. Of all the constraints of nature, the most far-reaching are imposed by space. And this is something which we have learned through modeling as well. So I would like to acknowledge the students who were involved in this work. Adam Ranions came up with this space colonization algorithm. Wojtek Pawłowski came with models of trees in which basically are controlled by light, and Stephen Longay implemented tree sketch. And if you are interested, actually, there are papers as well as software which I was using for all the demos. It's called the Studio, and Mac version is called VLAB. So it can be downloaded with a set of examples from the site algorithm.org, and tree sketch is available from App Store. And thank you very much for your attention.
I think we can entertain some questions, but I do want to say that was pure magic for me. At the end of the day, when my mind is exhausted, it's magic. Thank you.
That's why there was stardust.
Anyway, questions?
So, what about other environmental factors, things like soil quality, water, that kind of stuff?
So, of course, in the case of development of roots, they play a fundamental role. And actually, when we look into the development of leaves, actually this information about how, where space is available, this information propagates via hormones, not via light. So, however, it seems that it is very useful and constructive to look into the following questions. Two separate questions. How things react to different distances, and how these distances are measured. So it's possible to look at morphogenesis from quite a geometric point of view, and then ask separately the question, okay, so how distances are measured in this particular case? Is it by amount of light? Is it by the spectrum of light? Is it by draining of water? Is it by computation for hormones? And this was one lesson which actually we learned from this, and we are trying now to move further to kind of develop a geometric theory of morphogenesis, a little bit further removed from things like reaction diffusion, and where we are looking at this is just an implementation of basic geometric properties.
So, but does it hugely increase your number of variables?
No, to the contrary, it is often reducing them. Well, a good example of this, there is a plant hormone called auxin, which is involved in lots of processes. It regulates branching, it regulates venation patterns, it also regulates, in particular, what is called phylotactic patterns. So it is distribution of, very regular distribution of, well, say florets or seeds in sunflower. It is very kind of well-defined pattern. This pattern is also well governed by computational for space. It is possible to model it at the level of molecules, but then you have to go into molecular details of the processes there. Or you can perform this in two steps. First, find out what kind of distance measuring properties this processes have, and then have quite a simple model of phyllotaxis expressed in terms of the distances. And the same we have done regarding modeling of the shape of leaves. So you can have a model operating directly on the molecular level, or you can say what is actually happening there is we are measuring the distances along the margin, and between existing veins, and morphogenetic process reacts to this. So we perceive this very much as a simplification rather than complexification. Yes, please?
I'm a biologist, and in biology we are pretty much indoctrinated with the natural selection, that everything is basically generated through natural selection. While plants, trees are living things, and in biology most people believe that natural selection shaped those forms. Now you demonstrate that just simple algorithms can shape those forms. My question as biologist is, which of those parameters can be recognized as something which might imitate natural selection, or is it just the matter that we actually mathematically can describe the world without natural selection?
So this is a very good question indeed, and in the case of trees, we didn't look at them from the viewpoint of natural selection yet. In the case of inflorescences, we did. And it turns out that actually, while the division into racemes, cymes, and so on is true, one can create a single model in which, depending on parameter values, you are going to get racemes or cymes or panicles and everything in between. And then actually we looked into this from the following perspective. One factor is predictability of climate. So if you have a panicle, it grows in such a way that it branches without producing flowers, and then produces flowers. So this would mean that if season is too short, it might wind up not producing any fruits. On the other hand, if you have raceme, then it is kind of more bed hedging. It produces some flowers, but it still keeps some the apex to produce more flowers. So if this is a situation in which we can show that if we have very stable climate, then being a raceme or being a panicle is advantageous. If the duration of season is more varied, then being raceme or cyme is advantageous. And then you went to look into a database of dicot plants, and it turned out that actually, if in a statistically significant way, it can be shown that, in the case of in the tropical climate, which is, apart from hurricanes and so on, more predictable, there is more panicles, while in the case of temperate climate, racemes and cymes are more visible. So there's a paper about this, and I would be happy to point you to this. So this was one case when we really tried to look at this from the value from an evolutionary perspective, and not purely from developmental mechanisms.
Side question. So you were trying, what you were trying to do is creating trees that look like what we see around here. What would be interesting is what would happen, for example, if the tree would grow, I don't know, a different plant, you know, what sort of, I know if the concentration of certain parts of the certain chemical elements in the air would be different. Can we sort of adapt? So if we alter the environment, what would happen to them?
Yes. So you mentioned that how a tree would be growing in a different planet, correct? Yes. So here we can freely fantasize because it is difficult to contradict our predictions. However, if actually it turns out that these processes have very universal kind of character. So in particular, in the case of corals and sponges, you can discover very much similar architectures. And it's actually strikingly so, and there are plants which are living in water, so it's quite different environment. Moreover, branching structures in animals, in particular structure of lungs, grow they grow very much in the same way as trees, and moreover, it is known that there are molecules which are playing the role of this markers of free space. So in our case, markers of free space was an abstraction. In the case of the development of lungs, actually they really exist. So this, I would say that this actually indicates that these processes have quite a universal character, and actually it also corroborates this point of view that there may be different molecular processes which produce similar outcomes, because at the end, geometry of these processes is similar. So I would say that if there are trees on some other planet, so either there will be something completely different, because of this, it will be something like from science fiction. For me, this is an example of Solaris. Okay, which is the entire point of this book and movie was that there is a form of life which is so different that completely cannot comprehend it. But there is something which looks more or less like a tree, then I think that although it is almost circular argument, that these processes will be related, because we see them in such very different situations on the Earth.
Well, perhaps we can continue the discussion over some cheese and beer and wine, and it is a cash bar. Hey, we don't want to speed on the public first.